In the spring of 2016, a quiet arrest in a small Iowa town would finally answer a question that had haunted two families for over 2 decades. But the person led away in handcuffs that morning wasn't who anyone expected. And the reason it took so long to reach that moment had nothing to do with missing evidence or advanced technology. It had everything to do with what people chose not to see. Before I reveal how silence, loyalty, and a single overlooked conversation led to this arrest, go ahead and subscribe. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far these stories reach. These are stories about what happens to people when answers never come, and about the cost of looking the other way. The town of Dysart, Iowa sits in Tama County, a place where farmland stretches in every direction and most people know each other by first name. In 1994, it was home to just over 1,300 people. The kind of place where doors weren't always locked, where high school football games drew half the town on Friday nights, and where tragedy, when it came, felt like a personal wound to everyone who lived there. On the night of September 17, 1994, 2 men walked into a local bar just after dark. Both were familiar faces. One was 33 years old, the other 38. They weren't strangers to the establishment or to each other. They'd known one another for years, moved in overlapping circles, shared mutual friends. By all appearances, it was an ordinary Saturday night. But by morning, both men would be dead. The details of what happened inside that bar were murky from the start. There were conflicting accounts, fragments of conversation, raised voices that some people heard and others claimed they didn't. What wasn't in dispute was the outcome. Sometime before midnight, violence erupted. It was sudden, brutal, and final. When police arrived, they found the 2 men's bodies near the back of the bar. The scene was chaotic. Blood spatter marked the walls. Overturned furniture suggested a struggle. There were witnesses present, but their stories didn't align. Some said they saw everything. Others said they saw nothing at all. The victims were identified quickly. The first was a mechanic who lived on the edge of town, a man with a young daughter and a reputation for being easygoing, someone who kept to himself but was always willing to lend a hand. The second was a construction worker, older, more weathered, known for a quick temper but also for showing up when people needed help. Neither man had a violent criminal history. Neither had enemies anyone could name. And yet, here they were. To detectives arriving that night, the scene felt wrong. Not just because of the violence, but because of the silence that followed. Witnesses who had been inside the bar when it happened suddenly couldn't remember details. People who'd been standing feet away claimed they hadn't seen who started it. Even the bartender, who'd been working that night, offered only vague recollections. It was as if an entire room of people had agreed, without saying so, to forget. The investigation began the way most homicide investigations do, with interviews, evidence collection, and an attempt to reconstruct the final moments of 2 men's lives. Detectives canvassed the area, spoke to everyone who'd been in or near the bar that night, and tried to piece together a timeline. But the more they asked, the less they seemed to learn. One witness said the altercation started over a disagreement about money. Another said it was personal, something that had been building for weeks. A third claimed it was random, a fight that escalated too quickly for anyone to stop. None of these accounts could be confirmed. None of them led anywhere solid. Forensic evidence was limited. This was 1994, in a small-town Iowa bar, not a sterile crime scene with surveillance cameras and digital records. What physical evidence existed was collected and catalogued, but it didn't tell the whole story. Blood samples were taken. Fingerprints were lifted. Shell casings were recovered. But without clear witness testimony to anchor the evidence, detectives were left trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The case remained open, but progress stalled. Leads dried up. Witnesses stopped returning calls. The community, which had been shaken in the immediate aftermath, began to settle back into routine. Life went on, as it always does, even when questions remain unanswered. But for the families of the 2 men who died that night, life didn't go on. It stopped. The mechanic's daughter was 11 years old when her father was killed. She'd been staying with her grandmother that weekend, waiting for him to pick her up Sunday morning. When he didn't show, she thought maybe he'd forgotten, or maybe his truck had broken down. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when her grandmother sat her down with red-rimmed eyes, that she understood her father wasn't coming home. In the years that followed, she would grow up without him. She would graduate high school, start college, get married, have children of her own. And through all of it, she carried the weight of not knowing why. Why her father had been in that bar. Why the fight had started. Why no one seemed willing to tell the truth about what happened. The construction worker's family faced a similar burden. His brother, who lived 2 towns over, spent years trying to make sense of the night. He visited Dysart repeatedly, spoke to anyone who would talk to him, pressed detectives for updates. But the answers never came. He began to wonder if they ever would. To the people of Dysart, the deaths became a kind of shared wound that no one wanted to touch. In a town that small, silence isn't just a choice, it's a survival mechanism. People had to keep living together, working together, seeing each other at the grocery store and the gas station and church on Sunday. Bringing up what happened that night in 1994 meant risking fractures in relationships that held the community together. So most people didn't bring it up. To the people of Dysart, the deaths became a kind of shared wound that no one wanted to touch. In a town that small, silence isn't just a choice, it's a survival mechanism. People had to keep living together, working together, seeing each other at the grocery store and the gas station and church on Sunday. Bringing up what happened that night in 1994 meant risking fractures in relationships that held the community together. So most people didn't bring it up. But silence, no matter how thick, doesn't erase truth. It only buries it. In the months after the murders, detectives continued working the case, though with diminishing resources. The Tama County Sheriff's Office was small, stretched thin across a rural area with limited manpower. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation assisted, but without new leads or cooperative witnesses, even their involvement couldn't break through the wall of silence that had formed around the case. One detective in particular refused to let it go. He'd been one of the first responders that night, had seen the bodies, had looked into the eyes of witnesses who claimed they saw nothing. He knew someone in that bar had seen exactly what happened. And he knew that person was lying. He spent months re-interviewing witnesses, cross-referencing their statements, looking for inconsistencies. He found plenty. But inconsistency isn't the same as evidence. People misremember. People get confused. People protect themselves and each other. Proving that someone was lying, and proving what the truth actually was, were two very different things. The detective kept a file on his desk, thick with notes and photographs and witness statements that contradicted each other in small but significant ways. He would pull it out on slow afternoons, read through it again, hoping something would click. Sometimes his colleagues would ask if he was still working the Dysart case. He'd nod, not looking up. He didn't need to explain. In small-town law enforcement, some cases stay with you. This was one of them. But even the most dedicated detective can't solve a case when no one will talk. By 1996, the investigation had effectively stalled. The case remained open, but active leads had evaporated. The families were told that investigators would continue following any new information that came in, but that without fresh evidence or testimony, there wasn't much more that could be done. It was the conversation every family of a murder victim dreads, the one where hope is gently, reluctantly, set aside. The mechanic's daughter was 13 by then. She'd learned to stop asking her grandmother about the case, because the answers were always the same. No updates. No arrests. No justice. She started telling people her father had died in an accident. It was easier than explaining that he'd been murdered, and no one seemed to care enough to find out who did it. The construction worker's brother stopped calling the sheriff's office. He'd been told, politely but firmly, that pestering detectives wouldn't make the case move faster. He started keeping a journal instead, writing down everything he remembered about his brother, every conversation he'd had with potential witnesses, every theory he'd developed. He didn't know what else to do with the anger and frustration that had nowhere to go. In Dysart, the bar where it happened changed ownership. The new owners did some renovations, painted the walls, replaced the flooring. People still came in for drinks, but if you asked anyone who'd been around in 1994 about what happened there, you'd get a tight smile and a change of subject. What no one realized at the time was that the truth hadn't disappeared. It had just been absorbed into the daily life of the community, carried by people who went about their routines while holding on to secrets that grew heavier with each passing year. Memory is a strange thing. In the immediate aftermath of trauma, details are sharp, almost painfully clear. But as time passes, those details start to soften, blur, rearrange themselves. People convince themselves they didn't see what they saw, or that what they saw didn't mean what they thought it meant. Self-preservation, guilt, fear, loyalty, all of these things reshape memory into something more bearable. But for some people, the truth doesn't soften. It hardens. By the year 2000, 6 years had passed since the murders. The case files had been moved to storage, though they were never officially closed. The detective who'd worked it so doggedly had retired, though he still lived in the area. He'd pass through Dysart occasionally, see familiar faces, wonder which of them knew more than they'd said. The families had learned to live with the absence of answers, though learned might be too strong a word. They survived it. They endured it. The mechanic's daughter finished high school and left for college in another state. The construction worker's brother visited less frequently, though he never stopped thinking about his brother or the night he died. The town, meanwhile, continued. New families moved in. Old families moved away. Children who'd been in elementary school in 1994 were now adults with jobs and responsibilities. The murders became something that had happened a long time ago, a tragedy that people mentioned in passing when explaining the town's history, but not something that felt urgent or unresolved. Except to the people who'd been there. To them, September 17, 1994, was still happening. What time is it where you are right now? Wherever you're watching from, whatever hour of the day or night, I want you to think about how much has happened in your life over the past 20 years. The people you've met. The people you've lost. The versions of yourself you've left behind. Now imagine carrying a secret through all of that time. Imagine what it would do to you. The years between 2000 and 2010 were quiet ones for the case. No major developments. No breakthroughs. No dramatic revelations. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. People who'd been in their 20s and 30s in 1994 were now in their 40s and 50s. Relationships had changed. Marriages had ended. Friendships had fractured. The social dynamics that had once held certain secrets in place were starting to loosen. And when people's lives fall apart, they sometimes start talking. It began with small things. A comment made during an argument. A drunken confession to a bartender in a different town. A chance remark overheard at a family gathering. None of these things were reported to police. None of them made it into official channels. But they circulated, quietly, the way information does in small communities. One woman, who'd been friends with someone who'd been at the bar that night, heard something that made her pause. She didn't know if it was true. She didn't know if it mattered. But it stuck with her. She mentioned it, cautiously, to someone else. And that person mentioned it to someone else. And slowly, over years, a different version of events began to take shape. This version wasn't radically different from what detectives had suspected all along. But it had names attached to it now. Specific details. A sequence of events that made sense. In 2008, a tip came into the sheriff's office. It was vague, anonymous, the kind of thing that might normally be dismissed. But the detective who received it, a younger officer who joined the department years after the murders, had recently been reviewing old cases. He'd read through the file on the 1994 deaths, had been struck by how many witnesses had claimed to see nothing. The tip, small as it was, gave him a thread to pull. He started making calls. Not formal interviews, just casual conversations. He spoke to people who'd been peripherally involved, people who'd moved away but still had ties to the area. He asked about the bar, about the night in question, about the 2 men who died. Most people had nothing new to say. But a few people hesitated before answering, and in those hesitations, he heard something. He went back through the original witness statements, looking for contradictions, for anything that suggested someone had been protecting someone else. He found patterns. Certain witnesses had given nearly identical accounts, as if they'd coordinated their stories. Other witnesses had changed their stories between the first and second interviews, walking back details they'd initially offered. One name kept appearing in the margins of the file. Not as a suspect, exactly, but as someone who'd been present, someone who'd been interviewed multiple times, someone whose account had shifted in subtle but significant ways. The detective started building a timeline of this person's life since 1994. Where they'd lived. Where they'd worked. Who they'd been close to. And as he did, he noticed something. In the years immediately after the murders, this person had stayed in the area, had maintained relationships with many of the same people who'd been at the bar that night. But around 2005, something had changed. They'd moved. Severed ties. Started over somewhere else. It could have been coincidence. People move for all kinds of reasons. But the detective didn't think it was coincidence. He began reaching out to people who'd known this individual, asking careful questions, trying not to reveal too much. And slowly, he started to hear a different story. Not a confession. Not even close. But a story that suggested this person had carried something heavy for a long time, and that the weight of it had eventually forced them to distance themselves from their old life. In 2012, the detective decided it was time to re-interview this individual directly. It had been 18 years since the murders. 18 years since anyone had seriously pressed this person for answers. The detective hoped that time, and distance, might have changed their willingness to talk. He made the drive to the small town where this person now lived, a few hours from Dysart. He'd called ahead, framed it as a routine follow-up, nothing confrontational. When he arrived, the person agreed to speak with him, though they seemed wary. They sat in a living room that smelled like coffee and old carpet. The detective asked general questions at first. How had they been? What had brought them to this town? Did they still keep in touch with people from Dysart? The answers were guarded but polite. No, they didn't go back much anymore. No, they'd lost touch with most people from that time. It had been a long time ago. They'd moved on. Then the detective asked about the night of September 17, 1994. The person's expression didn't change, but their hands did. They folded them in their lap, then unfolded them, then folded them again. They said they'd already told the police everything they knew back then. They didn't know why it mattered now. The detective said he understood. But he also said that sometimes people remember things differently after time has passed. Sometimes people feel differently about what they saw or heard. Sometimes people reach a point where keeping silent feels worse than speaking up. The person didn't respond right away. They looked out the window, toward a street where nothing was happening, where the afternoon light was starting to fade. Then they said something that made the detective sit forward. They said, "I never wanted anyone to get hurt." It wasn't a confession. Not yet. But it was the first crack in a wall that had stood for 18 years. The detective didn't push. He let the silence sit. And in that silence, the person kept talking. They talked about how young they'd been in 1994. How scared they'd been when it happened. How everyone at the bar had been told, not in so many words but clearly enough, that it was better for everyone if certain details stayed vague. They talked about how hard it had been to live in Dysart after that, knowing what they knew, seeing the families of the two men around town, feeling the weight of it every single day. They talked about why they'd finally left. Not because they were running from the law, they'd never believed the police were close to solving it, but because they couldn't carry it anymore. Because every time they saw someone from that night, they felt like they were drowning. The detective listened. He took notes, but not many. He wanted this person to feel like they were just talking, not being interrogated. And as they talked, a picture began to emerge. Not of what happened, the detective still didn't have that, but of why the case had stalled for so long. It wasn't that there had been no witnesses. It was that the witnesses had been too afraid, or too loyal, or too complicit, to tell the truth. Over the next few months, the detective returned several times. Each visit, the person shared a little more. They named other people who'd been present. They described the moments leading up to the violence, the arguments that had been simmering all night, the way tension had built until it broke. They explained how, in the aftermath, everyone had panicked. How someone had taken charge, told everyone to keep their mouths shut, convinced them that if they all stuck to the same vague story, no one could be held responsible. And for 18 years, that strategy had worked. But guilt, the detective was learning, has a long half-life. By early 2014, the detective had enough to reopen the investigation formally. He brought in other officers, shared what he'd learned, and together they began building a case. They re-interviewed witnesses from 1994, armed now with information that contradicted the original statements. Some people stuck to their old stories. Others, when confronted with the inconsistencies, started to crack. One woman, who'd been tending bar that night, admitted she'd lied about how much she'd seen. She said she'd been terrified at the time, and by the time she realized she should have told the truth, so much time had passed that it seemed too late. She said she was sorry. She said it had eaten at her for years. A man who'd been sitting near the back of the bar admitted he'd seen the confrontation start. He'd seen who threw the first punch. He'd seen who pulled the weapon. He'd been told to say he'd been in the bathroom when it happened, and he'd gone along with it because he didn't want trouble. He said he'd thought about coming forward 100 times, but fear had always won. Slowly, painstakingly, the detectives assembled a clearer picture of what had happened that night. It wasn't the random bar fight it had been made to look like. It had been personal. It had been fueled by resentment and old grudges and a combustible mix of alcohol and pride. And it had been covered up, not by a criminal mastermind, but by a group of frightened people who'd convinced themselves that silence was safer than truth. But the most important piece of the puzzle was still missing. Who, exactly, had killed those two men? The person the detective had been speaking with knew. They'd always known. But naming names, putting it on the record in a way that could lead to prosecution, was a line they hadn't been willing to cross. Until, finally, they were. In the fall of 2015, after months of conversations, after weighing the cost of speaking against the cost of staying silent, this person gave a formal statement. They named the individual who'd been responsible for the deaths. They described what they'd seen in specific, unflinching detail. They acknowledged their own role in helping to obscure the truth. And with that statement, the case that had been cold for over 2 decades suddenly had a path forward. The person they named was still alive. Still living in Iowa, in fact, though not in Dysart. They'd moved away years earlier, just as so many others connected to that night had. They'd built a new life, held down a job, stayed out of trouble. To anyone who knew them in their current life, they were just another middle-aged person trying to get by. But they'd been at that bar in 1994. And according to multiple witnesses who were now finally willing to talk, they'd been the one who'd escalated a heated argument into lethal violence. The arrest happened on a quiet morning in the spring of 2016. Detectives drove to the small town where the suspect now lived and knocked on the door of an unremarkable house on an unremarkable street. The person who answered seemed more resigned than surprised. They'd known, on some level, that this day might come. Maybe they'd been waiting for it. They were taken into custody without incident. No dramatic chase. No confrontation. Just a pair of handcuffs and a long, silent drive to the county jail. Word of the arrest spread quickly through Dysart. For a community that had lived with this unsolved case for more than 2 decades, the news was both shocking and strangely anticlimactic. Shocking because many people had assumed the case would never be solved. Anticlimactic because the person arrested wasn't some shadowy outsider or criminal mastermind. It was someone who'd been part of the community, someone people had known and seen and lived alongside for years. The mechanic's daughter, now in her early 30s, heard about the arrest from a phone call. She was at work, and she had to step outside to process what she'd just been told. Someone had been arrested for her father's murder. After all this time. After all the years of being told there were no leads, no progress, no hope. She sat in her car in the parking lot and cried. Not tears of relief, exactly. The relief would come later, maybe, if there was a conviction. These were tears of something more complicated, grief that had been held in suspension for 22 years, suddenly released because there was finally something to grieve toward. The construction worker's brother got the news from a detective who'd been kind enough to call him personally. He listened to the details, thanked the detective, hung up the phone, and sat very still. He thought about all the years he'd spent trying to get answers. All the phone calls. All the dead ends. All the nights he'd lain awake wondering if anyone would ever be held accountable. He thought about his brother, who'd been 38 when he died, who'd never gotten the chance to grow old or meet his nieces and nephews or retire or do any of the things people take for granted. And he thought about the person who'd taken that away from him, who'd been living their life all this time while his brother had been in the ground. Justice, he knew, wouldn't bring his brother back. But it was something. After 22 years of nothing, it was something. The legal process that followed was slow and complicated. The defense argued that the case was too old, that memories were unreliable, that the physical evidence was inconclusive. They pointed out that some of the witnesses who were now testifying had previously given statements that contradicted their current accounts. They argued that their client was being railroaded by an overzealous investigation that was more interested in closing an old case than in finding the truth. The prosecution countered that the witnesses had lied initially out of fear, and that their new statements were consistent not only with each other but with the physical evidence that had been collected in 1994. They brought in experts to testify about the blood spatter patterns, the trajectory of the weapon, the timeline of events. They presented the case methodically, carefully, building a narrative that was supported by both testimony and forensics. But they also did something else, something that spoke to the heart of why this case had remained unsolved for so long. They called witnesses to explain why they'd stayed silent for over 2 decades. And in doing so, they painted a picture of a community that had been paralyzed by fear and loyalty, that had chosen collective silence over individual truth. One witness, testifying with visible discomfort, said they'd been young and scared and hadn't wanted to be known as a snitch. Another said they'd been told that if they talked, they'd lose their job, their friends, their place in the community. A third said they'd convinced themselves that what they'd seen wasn't what they'd actually seen, that maybe they'd been mistaken, that it was better not to say anything than to say the wrong thing. The testimony was damning, not just for the defendant, but for everyone who'd been in that bar and chosen silence. It was a portrait of collective failure, of a community that had protected itself at the expense of 2 men who'd died and the families they'd left behind. If, listening to this, you feel like you would have fought for those 2 men with everything you had, subscribe. This is how that fight continues. Trolls won't. But people who understand that truth doesn't have an expiration date, people who believe that silence is never neutral, people who think justice matters even when it's late, those people will. The trial stretched over weeks. The courtroom in the Tama County courthouse was small, and it filled every day with people who'd followed the case, people who'd known the victims, people who were just curious to see how a 22-year-old mystery would finally play out. The mechanic's daughter attended every day of the trial. She sat in the same seat, in the second row on the right side, and she listened to every word of testimony. She heard people describe her father's final moments in clinical, detached language. She heard the defense try to poke holes in the prosecution's case, try to suggest that maybe no one could really know what had happened that night. But she also heard witness after witness describe what they'd seen. And she knew they were telling the truth, because the details they offered were too specific, too consistent, too painful to be fabricated. The verdict came in the late spring of 2016, nearly 22 years to the day after the murders. Guilty. The courtroom was silent for a moment after the jury foreman read the word aloud. Then there was a collective exhale, as if everyone in the room had been holding their breath. The mechanic's daughter closed her eyes. The construction worker's brother let his head drop forward. It was over. Or at least, this part of it was. Sentencing came a few weeks later. The judge, who'd presided over the trial with patience and care, spoke at length about the nature of the crime, the passage of time, and the importance of accountability. He acknowledged that 2 decades had passed, that the defendant was not the same person they'd been in 1994, that their life had changed in ways that made punishment complicated. But he also said that justice delayed is not the same as justice denied. That the families of the victims had waited long enough. That the community deserved to know that even old crimes have consequences. The sentence was significant, though not as severe as it might have been had the conviction come in 1995. The defendant was led out of the courtroom, head down, hands cuffed. They didn't look at the families. They didn't look at anyone. Outside the courthouse, the mechanic's daughter spoke briefly to a handful of reporters who'd gathered. She said she was grateful to the detectives who'd never given up, to the witnesses who'd finally found the courage to tell the truth, and to the jury who'd believed them. She said her father had been a good man who deserved better than to die in a bar fight and be forgotten. She said she hoped that now, finally, he could rest. The construction worker's brother didn't speak to reporters. He stood off to the side, watching, and when the cameras turned away, he walked to his car and sat inside for a long time before driving home. In Dysart, the reaction was complicated. Some people felt relief that the case had finally been solved. Others felt anger that it had taken so long, that so many people had known the truth and said nothing. Still others felt a kind of exhausted sadness, a recognition that the resolution of the case didn't undo the decades of pain and silence that had preceded it. The bar where it happened was still there, still operating under different ownership. On the night of the verdict, a few regulars sat at the bar and talked quietly about what had happened. One of them, who'd been a teenager in 1994, said they'd always wondered if the truth would come out. Another, older, said they'd known pieces of the truth for years but hadn't known what to do with the information. A woman sitting alone at the end of the bar, who'd moved to Dysart only a few years earlier and didn't know the history, asked what they were talking about. The regulars glanced at each other, and then one of them began to explain. About the murders. About the silence. About how long it had taken for anyone to be held accountable. The woman listened, and when the story was finished, she said, "But they got him, right? In the end?" One of the regulars nodded. In the end. But the woman's question lingered in the air, because, in the end, was a strange way to describe justice that came 22 years late. What does justice mean when it arrives decades after the crime? What does it mean to the families who've spent half a lifetime waiting for answers? What does it mean to the community that protected the guilty, whether through active lies or passive silence? These aren't questions with easy answers. For the mechanic's daughter, justice meant that her father's death had finally been acknowledged as what it was, a murder, not an accident, not a random tragedy, but a deliberate act for which someone was now being held accountable. It meant that the people who'd lied, who'd covered up, who'd chosen loyalty over truth, had been forced to confront their choices in a public courtroom. But it didn't bring her father back. It didn't give her the childhood she'd lost when he died. It didn't erase the years she'd spent feeling like no one cared enough to find out what happened to him. For the construction worker's brother, justice meant that his brother's name had been spoken aloud in a courtroom, that the circumstances of his death had been examined and validated. It meant that the person responsible wouldn't just walk away, wouldn't get to pretend it had never happened. But it didn't answer the deeper question he'd carried for 22 years, why? Why had his brother been in that bar that night? Why had the argument escalated the way it did? Why had so many people chosen to protect the person who killed him? For the people of Dysart, justice was even more complicated. It forced the community to reckon with its own complicity, to acknowledge that the silence that had protected one person had also failed two families. It raised uncomfortable questions about what people owe to each other, about when loyalty crosses the line into betrayal, about the long-term cost of choosing comfort over truth. And for the person convicted, what did justice mean for them? They'd lived with what they'd done for 22 years. They'd moved away, started over, tried to build a life separate from that night in 1994. Did the conviction bring them a kind of relief, a release from the secret they'd been carrying? Or did it feel like a punishment for a crime they'd committed as a younger, different person, a crime they might have believed they'd never have to answer for? The trial record doesn't include their thoughts on the matter. They didn't testify in their own defense. They didn't make a statement at sentencing. Whatever they felt, they kept to themselves. In the months after the conviction, life in Dysart gradually returned to normal. The reporters left. The courthouse emptied. The story, which had been headline news for a few weeks, faded from public attention. But for those who'd been closest to it, the case didn't fade. The mechanic's daughter found herself thinking about her father more, not less, in the aftermath of the trial. For so long, her grief had been tangled up with frustration and unanswered questions. Now that there were answers, the grief felt purer, sharper, harder to avoid. She started going through old photographs, things she'd kept in boxes in the back of her closet. Pictures of her father holding her when she was a toddler. Pictures of him working on cars in the driveway. Pictures of him at family gatherings, smiling at the camera with a beer in his hand. She realized that she'd been so focused on the circumstances of his death that she'd almost forgotten the fullness of his life. The trial had given her justice, but it had also given her permission to grieve him as more than a victim. He'd been a person. A father. Someone who'd loved her and been loved in return. She started talking about him more with her own children, who'd never met their grandfather. She told them stories about the kind of man he'd been, the things he'd cared about, the way he'd made her laugh. She wanted them to know him as more than a name in a cold case file. The construction worker's brother went through a similar process. For years, his relationship with his brother had been frozen at the moment of his death, 38 years old, killed in a bar fight, no answers, no justice. The trial had changed that, had allowed him to see his brother's death as something that had an explanation, a cause, a responsible party. And with that shift, he found he could remember his brother differently. Not just as a victim, but as the person he'd been. Flawed, complicated, sometimes difficult, but also loyal and generous and capable of surprising kindness. He started writing again, but this time not about the case or the investigation or the failures of the justice system. He wrote about their childhood, about the things they'd done together, about the ways his brother had shaped who he'd become. He didn't know if anyone would ever read these writings. That wasn't the point. The point was to remember, fully and honestly, without the shadow of unresolved violence obscuring everything else. For the witnesses who'd testified, the aftermath was harder. Some of them had been embraced by the community for finally telling the truth. Others had been shunned, accused of betraying someone who'd been part of their world, someone they'd known and cared about. The woman who'd been tending bar the night of the murders moved away from Iowa entirely after the trial. She couldn't stand the looks she got when she went to the grocery store or the bank, the quiet conversations that stopped when she entered a room. She'd done what she believed was right, but that didn't make it easy to live with. She settled in a town where no one knew her history, where she could be anonymous again. The man who'd testified about seeing the confrontation start stayed in the area, but he stopped going to the places he used to frequent. He'd lost friends over his testimony, people who felt he should have kept quiet, who said that dredging up the past after 22 years hadn't helped anyone. He disagreed, but he understood their anger. In a community that small, every choice ripples outward in ways that are impossible to predict or control. One witness, an older woman who'd been at the bar with her husband that night, said in an interview months after the trial that she wished she'd spoken up in 1994. She said she'd spent 22 years feeling sick every time she thought about those two men and their families. She said the trial had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, standing up there in front of everyone and admitting she'd lied, but it had also been a kind of release. She said she hoped the families could forgive her for waiting so long. She said she understood if they couldn't. The mechanic's daughter, when asked about forgiveness, said she didn't know yet. She said she was grateful to the witnesses who'd finally testified, but she was also angry that it had taken decades, that her father's case might have been solved in 1995 if people had just told the truth from the beginning. She said forgiveness wasn't something she could force. Maybe it would come with time. Maybe it wouldn't. Either way, she was done pretending to be okay with things she wasn't okay with, done making other people comfortable at the expense of her own feelings. The construction worker's brother was more philosophical. He said he understood why people had stayed silent. Fear is a powerful thing, and loyalty, even misplaced loyalty, is deeply human. He said he didn't hate the witnesses for their silence. He was just grateful they'd eventually found the strength to break it. But he also said that the case had taught him something about the fragility of truth, about how easily it can be buried under layers of fear and self-interest and social pressure. He said he'd become hyper-aware, in his own life, of the small moments where he had a choice between truth and convenience, between speaking up and staying silent. He said he tried, now, to always choose truth. Even when it was uncomfortable. Even when it cost him something. The detective who'd reopened the case reflected on it in an interview 2 years after the conviction. He said that solving a 22-year-old cold case had been the most challenging and rewarding work of his career. But he also said it had changed the way he thought about time and justice. He said that in the immediate aftermath of a crime, there's urgency. Everyone is focused on finding answers quickly, on bringing closure to the families, on holding someone accountable before the trail goes cold. And that urgency is important. It drives investigations forward. But he said that some cases can't be solved quickly. Some cases require time to erode the social structures that protect the guilty. Some cases need witnesses to grow older, to gain perspective, to reach a point in their lives where keeping silent feels worse than speaking up. He said the Dysart case had taught him to never truly give up on a cold case, because the factors that keep it cold, fear, loyalty, self-preservation, aren't permanent. They change as people change. And sometimes, if you're patient, if you keep the door open for people to come forward, they eventually will. He said he thought about that a lot when he looked at other unsolved cases in the county's files. How many of them might be solvable if someone, somewhere, just decided to finally tell the truth? The question hung in the air, unanswered. In the years since the conviction, the case has become something of a reference point in discussions about cold cases and witness cooperation. It's been cited in training materials for law enforcement, used as an example of how persistence and patience can eventually overcome a wall of silence. But it's also been cited in discussions about the limitations of justice. Because while the case was solved, while someone was held accountable, the resolution came so late that it raised as many questions as it answered. What about all the cases where witnesses never come forward? What about the families who wait decades and never get answers? What about the communities where silence is so deeply embedded that no amount of time will break it? The Dysart case was, in many ways, a success story. But it was a success story that almost didn't happen, that required an extraordinary convergence of guilt, timing, and investigative persistence. And that raises an uncomfortable truth: for every case like this one, there are dozens more where the silence holds, where the guilty are never named, where families die without ever knowing what happened to the people they loved. The mechanic's daughter thought about this sometimes. She thought about how close her father's case had come to remaining unsolved forever. If that one witness hadn't finally decided to talk to the detective. If the detective hadn't been persistent enough to keep coming back. If the other witnesses hadn't found the courage to support that first person's testimony. Any one of those things could have gone differently, and the case would still be cold. She felt lucky, in a strange way, that justice had come at all. But she also felt angry that luck had to be part of the equation, that whether or not a murder is solved can depend on factors as arbitrary as timing and courage and the specific dynamics of a particular community. She'd started volunteering with a victims advocacy group, offering support to families going through what she'd gone through. She'd learned that her experience, painful as it was, had given her a kind of expertise. She knew what it felt like to wait for answers that might never come. She knew what it felt like to hear people say they were doing everything they could when it didn't feel like enough. She knew what it felt like to finally get justice and realize it wasn't the clean, satisfying ending she'd imagined. She could talk to other families about all of that, and they understood her in a way most people couldn't. The construction worker's brother had also found a kind of purpose in the aftermath of the case. He'd started speaking publicly about the importance of cold case investigations, about the need for adequate funding and resources for law enforcement agencies working these cases. He'd learned, through his own experience, how understaffed and overwhelmed most small-town sheriff's offices were, how easily cases could slip through the cracks simply because there weren't enough people or enough hours to pursue every lead. He'd become an advocate for legislative changes that would provide more support for cold case units, that would ensure families like his had somewhere to turn when local resources ran out. He wasn't naive. He knew that no amount of funding or legislative support would solve every cold case. Some cases were just too old, too cold, too buried under layers of time and silence. But he believed, deeply, that every family deserved the effort. Every victim deserved to have their case worked, their name remembered, their death treated as something that mattered. And if his brother's case, painful and prolonged as it had been, could serve as motivation for systemic change, then at least some good had come from all those years of waiting. There's a small memorial in Dysart now, placed near the town center. It's simple, just a bench with a plaque that names the two men who died in 1994 and acknowledges that justice, though delayed, eventually came. The mechanic's daughter visits sometimes when she's back in Iowa. She sits on the bench and thinks about her father, about the life he had and the life he didn't get to have. She thinks about her own children, who are growing up in a world where their grandfather is a story, a memory passed down secondhand. She thinks about the person who killed him, who is serving time in a state prison several hours away. She's never visited. She doesn't plan to. She doesn't need to see them or hear from them. The trial gave her what she needed, an acknowledgement of what happened, a public reckoning, a name attached to the crime. What she does with that information, how she carries it forward, is up to her. The construction worker's brother has visited the memorial too. He stood in front of it on a cold afternoon in November, a few months after it was installed, and read his brother's name on the plaque. He thought about how strange it was that this small piece of metal, this official acknowledgement, mattered so much. But it did matter. It meant that his brother's death hadn't been forgotten, that the town had finally, publicly, admitted what had happened and who had been lost. He left flowers at the base of the bench, even though he knew they'd wilt in a few days. It wasn't about permanence. It was about the gesture, about marking the moment, about saying, in a tangible way, I was here. I remember. The case itself has faded from the headlines, as all cases eventually do. It's been years now since the conviction. The news cycle has moved on. The reporters who covered the trial have moved on to other stories. The public, which was briefly fascinated by the idea of a 22-year-old murder mystery finally being solved, has largely forgotten about it. But for the people who lived it, the families, the witnesses, the investigators, the community, it remains vivid. Time doesn't erase that kind of experience. It just changes the way you carry it. The detective who solved the case has since retired. He keeps a photo on his desk at home, a picture of the memorial bench in Dysart. He says it reminds him why the work mattered, even when it was frustrating, even when it seemed hopeless. He says he still thinks about the case sometimes, about all the years it took to break through the silence, about how close it came to never being solved at all. He says he's grateful it worked out the way it did. But he's also aware of how fragile the resolution was, how many things had to go right for justice to happen. And that awareness, he says, keeps him humble. The person convicted of the murders has been largely silent since the trial. They've declined media requests, haven't given interviews, haven't issued any public statements. Prison records show they've kept to themselves, haven't caused trouble, have participated in available programs. What they think about the case, about the conviction, about the decades of freedom they had before it all caught up to them, remains unknown. Maybe they feel remorse. Maybe they feel anger. Maybe they've convinced themselves they were unfairly prosecuted, that the witnesses lied, that the system failed them. Or maybe they've accepted it. Maybe, on some level, they'd been waiting for this moment since 1994, knowing that the secret they carried and the silence they'd relied on couldn't last forever. There's no way to know. And in some ways, it doesn't matter. The case isn't about their internal state or their feelings or their narrative. It's about the two men who died, the families who grieved, and the community that had to reckon with what it had allowed to happen through its silence. Their story, whatever it is secondary to that. Looking back on the case now, with the clarity that distance provides, certain patterns become visible. Patterns about how communities respond to violence. About how fear can be more powerful than conscience. About how silence, once established, can become self-reinforcing, building momentum until it feels impossible to break. The case also reveals something about the nature of truth. How it can be buried but not destroyed. How it can survive, in fragments, in the memories of people who carry it even when they won't speak it. How it can wait, patiently, for the right moment, the right question, the right person to finally let it surface. Truth, it turns out, is stubborn. The Dysart case proved that. It proved that even after 22 years, even after a community had collectively agreed to forget, even after the people involved had moved on with their lives, the truth could still emerge. It just needed someone brave enough to speak it, and someone persistent enough to listen. But the case also proved how rare that combination is. How many factors have to align. How much has to go right? And that's the uncomfortable reality that families of unsolved murder victims live with every day. The knowledge that justice is possible but not guaranteed. That the truth might be out there, held by someone who's too afraid or too loyal or too self-interested to share it. The knowledge that time is both an ally and an enemy, that it can erode the structures protecting the guilty, but it can also erode memory, evidence, and the will to keep fighting. For the families in this case, time eventually worked in their favor. But they had to wait 22 years to find that out. 22 years of not knowing. 22 years of wondering if anyone cared. 22 years of watching other cases get solved while theirs remained cold. That's not a small thing to ask of anyone. The mechanic's daughter is in her 40s now. Her children are teenagers. She has a career, a life, a routine. The case, while still significant, no longer dominates her existence the way it once did. But she says she'll never forget what it felt like to wait. The grinding, exhausting uncertainty of it. The way hope and despair became so tangled that she couldn't tell them apart anymore. She says she'll never forget the moment she got the call about the arrest, the way her hands shook, the way she had to pull over to the side of the road because she couldn't drive and process that information at the same time. And she says she'll never forget sitting in that courtroom, listening to the verdict, feeling something shift inside her that had been frozen for more than 2 decades. She says it wasn't closure, exactly. Closure isn't a real thing, she's decided. But it was resolution. It was an ending, even if it wasn't a happy one. And after 22 years, that was enough. The construction worker's brother feels similarly. He says the conviction didn't fix everything. It didn't bring his brother back or undo the damage caused by decades of silence. But it drew a line. It said, clearly and publicly, this happened, this person did it, and they will be held accountable. That line, he says, mattered more than he can fully articulate. It separated truth from rumor, fact from speculation, justice from abandonment. And in a case that had been defined by ambiguity and silence for so long, that clarity was profound. Both families have found ways to honor the men who died. The mechanic's daughter established a small scholarship in her father's name at the local high school, awarded annually to a student interested in automotive technology. It's a quiet memorial, not flashy or dramatic, but it ensures that his name is spoken every year, that his passion for fixing things is remembered. The construction worker's brother organized a fundraiser for a local veterans organization his brother had been involved with. The money goes towards supporting families of veterans dealing with loss. It's his way of channeling his grief into something constructive, of making sure his brother's death contributed, however indirectly, to helping others. These gestures don't erase what happened. They don't make the pain go away. But they transform it into something bearable, something that serves a purpose beyond suffering. And maybe that's all anyone can do in the aftermath of violence and loss, find a way to carry it that doesn't destroy you. The broader lessons of the Dysart case extend beyond the specifics of this particular crime. They speak to fundamental questions about community, accountability, and the nature of justice itself. What does a community owe to victims of violence? What are the limits of loyalty? At what point does protecting someone cross the line into complicity? These aren't abstract questions. They're questions that people in Dysart, and people in countless other small towns, have had to grapple with in real, concrete ways. The case also raises questions about the criminal justice system and its ability to handle cases that don't fit the standard timeline. Most systems are built for speed: arrest the suspect quickly, prosecute efficiently, move on to the next case. There's an assumption that if a case can't be solved within the first few months or years, it probably won't be solved at all. But the Dysart case proved that assumption wrong. And in doing so, it challenged law enforcement agencies to think differently about how they approach cold cases, about how they allocate resources, about how they maintain relationships with witnesses who might not be ready to talk today but might be ready in 5 or 10 or 20 years. It's a difficult balancing act. Agencies have limited resources. They can't keep every case active indefinitely. But they also can't afford to give up too early, to close doors that might need to stay open. The detective who solved the case said that one of the most important things he did was simply stay available. He made sure witnesses knew they could reach him. He checked in periodically, not aggressively, just enough to remind people that the case hadn't been forgotten. And when someone was finally ready to talk, he was there to listen. That kind of patience isn't always rewarded. Most cold cases don't get solved. Most witnesses never come forward. Most families never get answers. But some do. And the Dysart case is proof that maintaining that patience, that availability, that willingness to listen even decades later, can make the difference between justice and permanent silence. The case also highlights the role of guilt as a motivating force. The witness who first broke the silence did so, by their own account, because carrying the secret had become unbearable. They tried to move on, tried to build a new life, but the weight of what they knew kept pulling them back. Guilt, in that sense, served justice. It created a pressure that eventually overcame fear. But guilt isn't reliable. Some people feel it intensely. Others seem immune to it. There's no way to predict who will eventually crack under the weight of what they know and who will carry it to their grave. And that randomness, the fact that justice can depend on the conscience of people who may or may not have won, is deeply unsettling. It means that some families will get answers not because the system worked, but because someone, somewhere, couldn't live with themselves anymore. And other families won't get answers because the people who know the truth have found ways to live with it just fine. That's not a system. That's luck. And victims' families deserve better than luck. The Dysart case, for all its eventual success, exposes the fragility of justice when it depends on human conscience rather than institutional capability. It shows how easily truth can be buried and how much has to go right for it to resurface. It's both inspiring and terrifying. Inspiring because it proves that even after decades, truth can still win. Terrifying because it reminds us how close it came to never happening at all. There's one more aspect of this case worth examining: what it reveals about memory and time. The witnesses who testified in 2016 were describing events from 1994. 22 years had passed. Memories, even vivid ones, change over that span of time. Details blur. Sequences get rearranged. Emotions color recollection. Defense attorneys hammered this point during the trial, arguing that the witnesses couldn't possibly remember what happened with the clarity and certainty they were claiming. And they had a point. Memory is fallible. Science has proven this repeatedly. But the prosecution argued something different. They argued that some moments are so traumatic, so significant, that they imprint themselves on memory in ways that resist normal decay. That watching two people die violently isn't the kind of thing you forget, even if the specific details soften around the edges. They also argued that what the witnesses were describing wasn't just memory, it was memory that had been reinforced through years of guilt and rehearsal. These weren't details people had thought about once and forgotten. These were details people had carried with them, consciously or unconsciously, for decades. The jury ultimately sided with the prosecution's interpretation. They believed that the core facts the witnesses were describing, who did what, in what sequence, with what result, were reliable enough to support a conviction. But the defense's questions lingered. How can we trust decades-old memories? How do we distinguish between what someone actually saw and what they've convinced themselves they saw over the course of 22 years? There are no perfect answers to these questions. Memory is messy. Justice requires clarity. Sometimes those two things are incompatible. But in this case, the physical evidence supported the witness testimony. The forensics matched the sequence of events the witnesses described. The blood spatter patterns aligned with their accounts of where people had been standing, who had moved where, who had done what. So while memory might have been imperfect, it was corroborated. And that corroboration made it trustworthy enough. Still, the case raises important questions about how the justice system should handle very old cases where memory is a primary form of evidence. Should there be a statute of limitations on murder prosecutions based primarily on witness testimony? Should juries be given special instructions about evaluating decades-old recollections? These are questions without easy answers, questions that legal scholars and practitioners continue to debate. What's clear is that the Dysart case pushed the boundaries of what's possible in terms of prosecuting very old crimes based largely on human memory. And it succeeded, which means other prosecutors will be emboldened to try similar approaches in other cold cases. Whether that's a good thing or a dangerous thing depends on your perspective. For the families who got justice, it's unquestionably good. For defense attorneys worried about wrongful convictions based on faulty memories, it's potentially dangerous. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in between. The case also reveals something about how communities process collective trauma over time. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, Dysart was in shock. People were scared, confused, looking for answers. But as time passed and no answers came, the community adapted. It learned to live with the uncertainty, to incorporate the unsolved murders into its collective identity. The case became part of the town's story, something that had happened, something people whispered about but didn't dwell on. And then, 22 years later, the case suddenly wasn't part of the past anymore. It was present again, raw again, demanding attention and reckoning. For a community that had moved on, or at least thought it had, the reopening of the case was disorienting. It forced people to revisit a period they'd assumed was closed, to confront choices they'd made or witnessed decades earlier, to question whether moving on had been the right response or whether it had just been easier than staying engaged. Some people welcomed the reopening. They felt it was overdue, that justice had been deferred too long already. Others resented it. They felt it was stirring up old pain unnecessarily, that after 22 years, it would be kinder to everyone involved to just let it go. Both reactions are understandable. Both are human. But only one of them honors the men who died. As I near the end of this story, I want to return to where we began. To that quiet spring morning in 2016 when police cars rolled into a small Iowa town and made an arrest that no one expected. The person taken into custody that day had been living an ordinary life. They had a job, a routine, relationships. To people who knew them in 2016, they were just another person trying to get by in a difficult world. But they were also someone who had killed 2 men in 1994 and let other people take the blame, or at least the burden, of that knowledge. They were someone who had benefited from a community's silence, who had lived free while the families of their victims lived in anguish. And in 2016, after 22 years, that finally caught up to them. The arrest was the result of one person's guilt becoming unbearable, and one detective's refusal to give up. It was the result of witnesses finally finding the courage to speak, and a justice system that was willing to prosecute a case that was older than some of the lawyers working on it. It was the result of families who never stopped asking questions, even when it seemed like no one was listening. It was the result of time doing what time does, wearing away pretense, eroding loyalty, exposing truth. And it was almost miraculous in how close it came to never happening at all. If the witness who first came forward had decided to stay silent. If the detective had been assigned to other cases and never followed up. If the other witnesses had refused to corroborate. If the jury had sided with the defense's arguments about faulty memory. If any one of 100 small things had gone differently, the case would still be cold today. The 2 men would still be dead, but their deaths would still be unexplained. Their families would still be waiting. And the person responsible would still be free. Instead, there was resolution. Imperfect, delayed, complicated resolution. But resolution nonetheless. The mechanic's daughter knows who killed her father and why. She knows that person is in prison. She knows the community finally acknowledged what happened. She knows her father's death wasn't random or meaningless, but the result of a specific person's specific choice. That knowledge doesn't undo the 22 years she spent without it. But it gives those years a different meaning. They weren't wasted time. They were the time it took for truth to surface, for justice to arrive, for courage to overcome fear. The construction worker's brother has similar knowledge. His brother's death has context now, explanation, accountability. The person responsible has been named and punished. The silence has been broken. And while that doesn't bring his brother back, it honors his memory in a way that silence never could. For both families, justice came too late to erase the pain. But it came early enough to matter. And in the landscape of cold cases, where many families wait forever and get nothing, that's more than luck. It's a kind of grace. But it's grace that required effort. It required witnesses to overcome fear. It required detectives to persist. It required prosecutors to take a risk on a difficult case. It required a jury to trust decades-old memories. It required a community to finally confront what it had allowed to happen through its silence. None of that was easy. All of it was necessary. And the fact that it happened at all, after so much time, is worth acknowledging and honoring. These stories of cold cases solved, of families finding answers, of truth emerging after decades of darkness, matter because they prove that justice, while fragile and unpredictable, is possible. They prove that time doesn't erase responsibility. They prove that communities can find the courage to confront their own failures. They prove that even when everything seems lost, something can still be found. The Dysart case is one of those stories. A story of pain and patience, of silence and courage, of a community's failure and eventual reckoning. It's a story about two men who died too young, and the families who refused to let them be forgotten. It's a story about the cost of loyalty when loyalty protects the wrong people. And it's a story about the stubborn persistence of truth, even when everyone seems determined to bury it. Rest in peace to the mechanic who never made it home to his daughter. Rest in peace to the construction worker whose brother spent decades searching for answers. Your deaths weren't forgotten. Your names weren't erased. And the person who took you from your families was finally held accountable. It took 22 years. But it happened. And that matters. If you stay to the end, you're someone who wants to understand what really happens when the truth is buried. That kind of curiosity is rare. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, like, and share this with someone you know who values stories like this. I'll see you in the next one.